Well, it is my privilege to represent the Bible Exposition Department this morning, here for Bible Exposition, as I share with you in this spring faculty lecture series. In two chapel messages, so that would be this morning and next week at the same time, I invite you to consider with me the book of Ruth. The story has been described as tracing a journey from Bethlehem and back, a journey from famine to fullness, from futility to fertility. Now, ideally, the book of Ruth should be considered in 4 segments, but since we only have 2 chapel periods, we only have time to consider 2 chapters. And so this morning we will look at chapter 1. Next week we can look at chapter 4. And so that may seem odd. Rather than taking a linear approach to the book where we do chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3. In this series, we're approaching the book like layers of an onion, so as to consider the external parallel parts in chapters 1 and 4 separate from the internal parts, the chapters 2 and 3. In other words, the short story of Ruth is chiastically arranged. It's an A-B-B-A pattern, which corresponds to the 4 chapters. Each chapter is one of those letters. And we are attempting to unpack the material with sensitivity to the ancient oral culture and its literary forms. So, let's consider Ruth chapter 1 this morning. Here's how I would summarize chapter 1. After the bitterness of famine, relocation, and loss of her husband and sons, Naomi departs with her daughters-in-law, sends Orpah back to Moab, and arrives in Bethlehem, where she experiences God's provision through the harvest and through Ruth's extraordinary acts of faithfulness. Now, I would submit to you that the big idea of this chapter is that God is present in his provision and in his care for his people, even when they experience suffering. God is revealed in this chapter in many ways. We see how God graciously provides for his people and he cares for their needs. We see how God is present with his suffering people, even when his justice seems obscure. We see how God's faithfulness can be expressed through the faithfulness of others. We see how God cares for the vulnerable people of society. Indeed, the Ruth story is revelatory. It shows us God's character and his attributes in action. These kinds of themes must be the focus of our exposition and the foundation of our applications. And so first, what I would like to do this morning is to just make some expository remarks about particular verses in chapter 1. And then second, I'd like to synthesize the passage, at least the theological ideas of the passage in chapter 1. And then third, I'd like to suggest some trajectories for contemporary application. So let's first just make a few remarks about specific verses. Verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled. The very first verse sets the historical time frame, and it braces the audience for bad news. It's like, oh no, here we go again, back into the dark age of the judges. Indeed, the story opens with famine, flight, a spate of deaths, leaving Naomi bereft and bitter. Indeed, here we go again. But then the light begins to shine brightly as God provides providentially fertility for his people. The light begins to shine brightly as God's people show kindness to one another. The light begins to shine brightly as God rewards his people with present and future blessings. And so the story of Ruth teaches powerfully by way of luminous contrast with the dark period of the judges. So in the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. Flight to a foreign neighboring land due to famine was a relatively common phenomenon in the biblical world. Just think about Genesis and the patriarchs frequently fleeing back to Egypt because of famine. But given the assumption that God provides rain and provides produce, take for example Deuteronomy 28, which talks about that, and given the context of apostasy during the time of the judges, one might be justified to interpret this reference to famine as divine judgment. In fact, famine is specifically listed as an outcome for breaking covenant. We see this in Deuteronomy 11, Deuteronomy 28, Deuteronomy 32. So there was famine in the land. Verse 1 continues, in the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah. So what do we make of this? The name Bethlehem is an ironic name. It means house of bread, or perhaps we should say storehouse of food. But ironically, it's describing a town that lacks food. Okay, that should strike us. The phrase Bethlehem of Judah is also found in only 2 other books of the Old Testament. It's found elsewhere at the end of the book of Judges, and it's found in 1 Samuel 17, where David is being introduced. And I think this may partly explain the canonical placement of the book of Ruth between the books of Judges and Samuel, at least in the Greek canon, where Ruth comes between Judges and Samuel. That is, while the Judges' conclusion associates Bethlehem with unfaithfulness and with no king, the book of Ruth contrastively associates Bethlehem with faithfulness and with the birth of King David, and it thereby sets us up for 1 Samuel. So this does not seem accidental. Jump with me now down to verse 13. I'm not going to comment on all of the verses. I just want to highlight a few pieces before we bring it all together. In verse 13, Naomi tells her daughters-in-law that the Lord's hand has turned against me. Now, the imagery of God's hand can be a positive or a negative image in the Bible. In some contexts, it signifies blessing, guidance, protection. But in other contexts, and here in Naomi's mouth, I think God's hand signifies curse, discipline, judgment. The theme of God's justice and judgment will be picked up again in just a couple of minutes. Look at verse 15. Naomi said to Ruth, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go with her." Now, Orpah's people are clearly the Moabites, we know that, but her gods are somewhat undefined. While Chemosh was ostensibly the national deity of Moab, he was presumably beyond the reach of common people who would likely relate to the lesser deities of the pantheon. Since women often retained allegiances to their native deities even after marrying into a foreign family, Orpah's return to her people and her gods was all that Naomi could expect. From a literary perspective, however, Orpah's presence in the narrative may serve as a foil to Ruth, so that Orpah is merely depicted as a good daughter-in-law, doing what one might expect of her, while Ruth is depicted exceptionally as a great daughter-in-law. That's verse 15. Verse 16, this is the famous verse that we sing pop songs about. Verse 16, Ruth famously responds to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth's extraordinary speech to Naomi rings with biblical cadences of covenant and contract. Her expressions of commitment are primarily to Naomi. Her expression of commitment is not necessarily a confession of monotheistic theology. Not necessarily. When she previously married Machlon, she married the people and the God of Machlon. Here, she solemnly commits at minimum to continuing that same package deal by assuming the role of Naomi's daughter, even though she is not obligated to do so. Given her foreign background, Ruth's remarkable loyalty shines brightly during the dark age of the Judges, when the trend was toward syncretism and self-interest. I would argue that this account of Ruth's faithful actions, like those of other faithful foreigners in the Old Testament, could be viewed as an indictment against ethnic Israel, who was better equipped to act faithfully. Ruth's response to Naomi in verses 16 and 17 is foundational to the rest of the narrative, and it serves as her first recorded act of faithfulness, through which God will show his own faithfulness to his people. Verse 17, Ruth continues, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Now here, I just want to make a picky point about translations. The NIV and the NRSV nicely capture the contextual sense of Ruth's oath. She says, even if death separates. I think that's correct, rather than the majority translations, all the other English translations, which render it anything but death. These are actually two different statements. But no, the text, I think, is best read, even if death separates. So, addressing the typical concerns of childless widows, Ruth commits to care for Naomi in her old age, and in death, and in burial, perhaps even beyond the grave, since Ruth would also be buried in the same plot. By invoking the Lord's curse, Ruth effectively ends the deliberations and silences Naomi. That's in verse 18. And so, implicit in Ruth's commitment is her selfless choice to risk jeopardizing her own future, as she would likely be alone in her own old age, death, and burial. Okay, so those are a few of my expositional remarks. And so now I want to summarize some of the big theological concepts of the chapter. Again, I think it's useful to restate the big idea. That is, that God is present in his provision and care for his people, even when they experience suffering. God is present in this chapter both as a judge and as a provider. And Naomi experiences God's presence in both her hurts and her helps. God's judgment is implicit in verses 1 through 5, where dark themes like drought, disease, and death dominate the scene. And because deity played the most important role in cause and effect, both in history and in nature, Naomi intuitively accepts that her bitter situation is from the Lord's hand. It's important, however, to notice that even though Naomi is afflicted and destitute, she's not necessarily bitter or contemptuous toward God. I think this is often misunderstood. So she's not necessarily bitter or contemptuous toward God, nor does she adamantly claim personal innocence or accuse God of injustice. The text is silent about whether her circumstances are a consequence of her own sin, her late husband's sin, the corporate sins of her people, or something else. Regardless of this ambiguity about the cause of God's possible judgment in her life, Naomi is also experiencing God's provision in a number of ways. God's presence in the wake of tragedy is explicitly expressed by bringing an end to the famine. Look at verse 6. The Lord had visited his people, quote, by providing food for them. And I have to highlight, I love the Hebrew here. There's a lot of alliteration, and it says, latet lahem lachem, okay, giving food to them. And beautifully highlights God's activity. The gracious gift from God here, presumably based on his compassion and his commitment to his covenant people, provides the setting for the rest of the story as the two widows arrive in Bethlehem, just at the time when the barley harvest was beginning. God's provisions are also implied in the ways God cares for Naomi's personal needs. In her prayer for God's kindness toward her daughters-in-law, Naomi acknowledges that Orpah and Ruth have already been serving as agents of kindness toward herself. And then, in Ruth's extraordinary speech in verses 16 and 17, it's implied that God will continue to take care of Naomi's needs through Ruth's continued presence and actions. Indeed, God is present in his provision and care for his people, even when they experience suffering. So now let's discuss some trajectories for contemporary application. The most important principle in applying narratives like Ruth is to remember that the story is primarily, and if you're my students out there, you should be able to complete this sentence. Remember that the story is primarily revelation of God. It's not revelation of the human characters. It would be inappropriate, for example, to make Ruth's response in verses 16 and 17 into a blueprint for religious conversion, or to interpret Ruth as some kind of typological representation of the Gentile church. Likewise, the relationship of Ruth and Naomi is not intended as a model for in-law relationships today. You'd be surprised at how that gets applied. Or for wedding ceremonies today. I've always found that one ironic. Hear a daughter-in-law expressing her commitment to her mother, but we tend to use this in wedding ceremonies between husband and wife. Anyhow. There's also no need to condemn Orpah for returning to Moab, or even to evaluate and diagnose Naomi's psychological disposition. All of these are examples of what I see in the literature, and I think all of them miss the main point, which is that this is meant to be revelation of God. A better approach is to ask, what is learned about God through this story of Naomi and Ruth? It seems to me that three big themes readily emerge from the text. God is the gracious provider. God cares deeply for the disadvantaged. God is the sovereign judge. Let's take these in turn. First, God's provision for his people. It's expressed directly here by giving them a harvest of barley, and indirectly, God's provision is expressed by the past faithful actions of Orpah and Ruth, and the future faithful actions of Ruth. God's provision does not always come in the forms or in the time frame one might expect or select, but God knows the needs of his people. Hebrews chapter 4, a familiar passage, explains that Christ is a priest who empathizes with our weaknesses and that we can approach him with confidence in our time of need. Again, God's provision does not always come in the forms or time frame one might expect or select, but we know that God delights in giving good gifts to his people. Jesus explains that. If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Importantly, in Ruth chapter 1, we also observe that God often provides his love indirectly through the loving actions of his people toward each other. John reminds us that if we love one another, God's love lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. So our first major takeaway is one that is emphasized here, but it's found in the rest of the canon. It's that God is our gracious provider. And it's this other idea, too, that he often uses people to provide his love for those in need. And so the question is, and this may have myriad applications, the question is, how can you and I serve as instruments of God's provision to others? Second, the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 18, reveals God as the great king who defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. God is the one who loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. That's Deuteronomy 10, verse 18. And these attributes of God are certainly on display in Ruth chapter 1 as God protects and preserves disadvantaged women. God cares deeply for these disenfranchised women, and he expects his people to follow his lead so that his community can be a place of safety and thriving for those who are socially disadvantaged. This issue is emphasized throughout the scriptures. Just look at Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 24, 26, 27, Matthew 25, Acts 6, 1 Timothy 5, James 1. I could go on. These are just some of the highlights. This theme is all over the scriptures. It reminds me of the parable of the persistent widow, where Jesus explains, will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. And so, our second major takeaway about God's character is that God cares deeply for the disadvantaged, and that we are invited to embody those same characteristics today. How can you and I defend the weak? How can we bring justice to the oppressed in our own domains of influence? Third, God is the sovereign judge. But he usually does not disclose why he administers justice the way he does. It's generally true that suffering, like that described in Ruth chapter 1, is a consequence of sin. But the specific offense or offender is usually unknown to the sufferer. God's people in every age will inevitably wrestle to understand the causes of their crises, and they may be tempted to question God's justice. But a wise approach to suffering is to seek the Lord and to put trust and hope in him because he has purposes that are far better than we can understand. For the man who was born blind, Jesus explained, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this has happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Again, a wise approach to suffering is to seek the Lord and to put trust and hope in him because God remains present with his suffering people. Remember the words of the psalmist, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are, what? How does it go? With me, for you are with me. Or think about Psalm 139, where can I flee from your presence? So our third application is based on this idea of the revelation of God as the perfect judge. And our job is to trust in his purposes and rest in his presence, which is always with us. How are we doing with trusting and resting in the midst of life's trials? So those are the main points that I wanted to share with you today. Let me just summarize this and bring it together. Hearing the word of the Lord from Ruth chapter 1. This story shows how God is present in his provision and care for his people, even when they experience suffering. Let us trust God as our gracious provider. Let us care for the disadvantaged in the way that God cares for them. Let us trust God to be the perfect judge so that we can rest in his plan and in his presence. So that's the brief word for you today to consider. My prayer is truly that as we read the narratives of Scripture, that we would not be distracted by so many of the human elements that are present in the story, but rather hear what is revealed of God himself, how he's working in the narrative, how his attributes are in action. This is revelatory literature. That's its purpose. It's meant to teach us who he is so that we can become like him.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.